This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, October 25th edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back with you, broadcasting from my childhood home on Long Island, joined today by one of the original co-hosts of the podcast, and just one of the original hosts of the podcast, Mike Hogan. Mike, what's going on?
Hi, Pete. I guess we got a small crew today, huh?
There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
I can't remember. We didn't do too many shows, just us, really, at any point. But I feel like we must have done one at some point in the coming on now 200 editions of the podcast.
I'm sure we did. I don't know. It all blurs together. I don't even remember what I had last night for dinner, let alone what we did 200 episodes ago.
We should check that exact number and do something when we hit 200. I believe it's easy on iTunes, and the mention of iTunes will give me another opportunity to make a plea to our regular listeners to go ahead and leave a review on there if you want to help us out, just to enable more people to find the show, especially in this new incarnation of doing the live shows and hopefully getting on a super regular schedule starting soon. What do we have in mind for folks for content in the coming weeks and months, Mike?
Well, Friday we're going to go back to the 9:15 a.m. Eastern Time podcast, largely because of another conflict that you have. But then starting next week and going forward, we will be doing 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific Time. Makes it easy for the folks on the West Coast. And on Fridays, it means we lead straight in on DRF Live to the Matt Bernier Show. So you'll get 2 hours straight of DRF Live content on Fridays, which will be really cool.
And super appropriate, too.
Yes.
You know, with Matt, of course,
Exactly.
being the really probably more than anybody else, the reason this show exists was Matt coming on board at the DRF and coming up with the idea to do these kind of shows. So very appropriate to be leading into him, and I'm excited about the fact, I think we can talk about it now, to do a couple of shows with him during this Breeders' Cup Week extravaganza.
Exactly. Yeah, that Friday 11 a.m. DRF Players Podcast leading into noon, the Matt Bernier Show, that starts after the Breeders' Cup because, of course, next week you guys will all be out in beautiful Southern California at Santa Anita, and we'll have 3 podcasts next week, or I guess, 2 and a guest appearance on Matt's show? Is that what we're calling it?
Yeah, I think that's right. Though I do think it should appear in our podcast stream to make it easier for people. So technically,
yes.
Yeah, I think the half is right, and it's a great array of guests we have booked. Tuesday, we're going to be doing a special show all about European shippers. We have to get final confirmation, but as of this moment, it looks likely we will have Nick Luck from NBC, as well as Kevin Blake from At the Races in that Tuesday slot. Wednesday, as you said, Mike, will be hosting a regular edition of the podcast with special guest Matt Bernier, sort of a co-production of the Matt Bernier Show. Thursday, we 3, you, me, and JK, our absentee host, will be guests on the Bernier Show. And then why don't you tell folks at least what our tentative plans are for the webinars in the afternoon and tell them about timing on that.
Yeah, this is very exciting, and I think it's final enough that that we can not just say tentative. I'd say mark your calendars. We're going to have 4 sessions over 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday next week, kicking it all off Tuesday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time, with Andrew Beyer and Steve Davidowitz, as well as you and me, talking about all the Breeders' Cup races. That should be fantastic. Really looking forward to that one. Wednesday at 2, we're doing Mike Watchmaker and Randy Moss from, of course, NBC Sports as well. And then we're doing double duty, well, I guess triple duty if you count the podcast with Matt in the morning. But Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're doing another one of these webinars, or live handicapping sessions as we call them, with Mike Bernier and Dan Illman. That will be really cool.
I think that's with Mike Beer and Dan.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry, I misspoke. With Mike Beer and Dan Illman. And then we're capping it all off on Thursday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, with Jay Privman and Michael Vesey, of course, part of the DRF Clocker team. They'll be talking, among other things, about how the horses are looking out on the track and any last-minute information that you'll need to know before the races start in earnest on Friday, and then, of course, culminate with the big ones on Saturday.
It is a handicapping process throughout that week for me year to year, and I assume a lot of players, it's the same thing. The process has already begun. Hearing information about horses who may turn up, doing last-minute work, you can access some past performances already and get started. When we get pre-entries, then work will begin a bit more in terms of really having fields finalized and being able to look into things. Then for me, when we get the post-position draw at some point that week, that's where for me what I'd call the race design portion of my handicapping really takes place, looking to try to figure out exactly how races will be run, any subtleties, things that might have to do with jockeys and post position. And then still, even after that, for Breeders' Cup and Triple Crown to a lesser degree, as somebody who incorporates a lot of equine physicality and things like that into his handicapping, I always have my ear to the ground for who's training well, maybe looking to upgrade that B-level horse to an A-level horse, or find an A-level horse who I maybe just want to use as another horse in the sequence because they're not training well. And I think that part of the theory of having those handicapping sessions throughout Breeders' Cup week is just to aid you in that. I think a lot of people will have a decent amount of their work done at that point, will have some ideas of who they want to pick, but maybe you'll hear something during that session that gives you an idea, either on a horse to include or perhaps just a specific sequence in the 2 days of the Breeders' Cup where you're going to want to sink your money. So hopefully we're going to be able to help people out a lot that week. I know I'm looking forward to it very much.
Absolutely, and the way Andy Beyer approaches the race is going to be, I think, quite different from maybe how Mike Beer or Dan Illman or Randy Moss approaches the races. And I always learn something just by hearing approaches of smart handicappers that maybe are looking at things differently than how I am. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot. 7 1-hour sessions over the span of 3 days. But, that's what we live for, right?
I love it. I'm going to try my best to be a part of each and every one of them, despite traveling out there. I may need you to do some more of the heavy lifting in terms of hosting, but maybe I can jump on and provide color if I can't out-and-out host. It should be really good. The only thing I'd say in that schedule that there is a little bit of subjectivity, might change a bit. The folks who have NBC schedules might have to be juggled around, but I love the way you laid it out there, Mike. I'm hoping we can get it done exactly like that, and it's sure to help in your Breeders' Cup handicapping. Lots of great stuff happening on DRF.com, your home for the Breeders' Cup. Let's take a little bit. I do want to talk more Breeders' Cup on the show today, but let's talk about our absentee co-host for a minute. Tournament players, folks who are familiar with the DRF Tournaments website, have already noticed this surely. But don't worry, Jonathan's absence today is not connected with the brutally bad beat that he took on Sunday. We were actually sitting together in the Bluegrass room at Keeneland. We were at Mike Maloney's table. Mike was absentee, a rare thing in and of itself. But we were holding down his table, and he ended up in a dead heat for 6th in a contest where 6 Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge seats were being given away, and lost the tiebreaker. The first tiebreaker was still a dead heat. He and Christopher Skinner had the same amount of winners, but the second tiebreaker, and it's as good a tiebreaker as any, was the number of points winners only. And by that measure, he missed out just by a couple of dollars. But don't worry, I figure some people are like, JK is so sour that he couldn't even show up for the podcast. Not the case. Just had a little traveling snafu this morning. I've had quite a day myself. Got up at 3:30 in the morning in lovely Lexington, Kentucky, and flew back here to Long Island, where my daughter is staying with my mom. I saw JK in the airport. He just, it's standby life. He gets a little delayed. One little thing happens, and all of a sudden, it can mess up an appearance. Hopefully, I told him, better to miss this show than all the exciting upcoming Breeders' Cup stuff. But don't worry, starting tomorrow, tournaments.drf.com, there are going to be feeders, credit builders, matchup contests for the final Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge qualifier coming up at this weekend. I believe it's on Sunday once again. JK's name will be there. You listeners, you should have your names in there too. Pretty amazing chance to win your $10,000 seat to the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge. And best of all, the way I would approach it would be, if I weren't already planning on going to the Breeders' Cup, I would say, hey, here's my opportunity to get a VIP trip to the Breeders' Cup. But maybe some people, it's last minute, they have some other things going on, a party that night, a game to attend in the morning, whatever it is. This year, you can not only play at one of 3 or 4 approved simulcast sites. You can find the official list. I don't want to say it and get it wrong. Find the official list, breederscup.com/BCBC. I think it's Gulfstream. Actually, I think I do know. I think it's Gulfstream, Churchill, and Aqueduct, but double check me on that. You can also this year play online, so don't miss this opportunity. That contest is going to sell out, so consider reserving a spot. Maybe try to qualify for a second one. It's going to be a great tournament and something that I'm looking forward to. I have a feeling JK will end up with one entry regardless, and I know he's going to be going for that second. But have you ever heard of a beat quite like that, Mike? Yeah,
it's pretty tough. I guess there have been some amazing bad beats, but to tie and then lose the tiebreaker is a little heartbreaking. But I know it's Jonathan. I know it just brushes off. He brushes it off. He doesn't dwell on those things, and it's I'm sure the right attitude to have, but still tough.
Yeah, we'll be talking to him more about it. He was very philosophical. He looked at it closely. There were some situations where he made mistakes. We'll wait till he's on the show to talk about the specifics of that. But I think it's the kind of thing where he'll only ultimately become a better player for it. I haven't seen it in 2.5 years of covering BC qualifying and NHC. I haven't seen somebody lose out on the big prize on a heater. So yeah. It is an unusual thing, but as Maloney himself texted back when we were talking to him, we were explaining the situation to him. He said to me, "It'll take more than that to keep my man down," and I think those words ring true for Mr. Kinchin. So we'll keep our ears out for him. We'll talk to him about that on Friday's show. I might have to write a whole piece about it. It was really pretty notable circumstance. Some other big names. I have a whole piece about that on DRF.com right now. Those tournaments, but just off the top of my head, Amy Brantley, NHC Tour regular, got her Breeders' Cup seat in that tournament. Our friend Paul Sherman got a BCBC seat out of it. Perhaps that's an excuse to bring him back on to talk racing on Friday. Another big name and friend of the podcast, Roger Satina, in another online contest for the NHC on Sunday, ended up getting 2 entries in qualifying position. He only can get the one extra seat, but gets his second seat to the NHC. Roger, of course, with as much success as anybody in NHC Tour history, really, or NHC Finals history, with 2 second-place finishes for 6-figure scores. Nice to see him back double-barreled at this year's NHC. Should be fun. Mike, what were you up to this weekend?
Oh boy, what was I up to? Just running around a little bit with the kid. We actually went on Sunday to a place in Brooklyn, probably not too far from you. It's a barbecue place that has a country band, and as my son says, we watch the Cowboys play music. So
that's awesome.
So we did a little of that, and Saturday just kind of laid low. Nothing too noteworthy. Just family stuff.
I had a really good day. 2 days out at Keeneland. We did Saturday in the green room, Sunday in the bluegrass room. 2 of my favorite places there because you don't need to do the whole fancy dress thing, and a great opportunity to catch up with some folks. But it's amazing how fast the time goes down there to be in Lexington and not even get a chance to meet up with and see several friends. It just makes me realize I need to take another trip down to Keeneland soon. It really is becoming a close third to me behind my currently stated dead heat between Santa Anita and Saratoga as my favorite racetrack. It's right there. It's right there pressing the pace. I think some of that formality that you get out of our friends, the Greencoats, might ever keep it from cracking the exacta for me. But I still, the more I get to Keeneland, the happier I am.
That's awesome. And you were flying back early, so I knew something probably was up when I got a text from you at like 5 something this morning.
What were you doing up?
I wasn't. I just checked my phone after I woke up.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we had our ducks in a row for the week. Let's chat a little more about the Breeders' Cup. We had a question come in from our listener and friend of the podcast, Barry Spears, about specifically talking about that Thursday 2 p.m. Eastern webinar we're going to be doing about how you include the Breeders' Cup works into your handicapping. He suggests only downgrading horses on works, which I've heard that theory, but he wanted to know how we approach workouts. I'll let you speak to that, Mike.
I approach them, and I put some weight in them. I put probably a little less weight in the, I guess we'll call it, for lack of a better word, established stakes horses than I would for some of the more lightly raced ones or some of the juveniles. I think that's a much bigger part of my handicapping, at least as far as the works go. Or if there's more of an unknown horse that's really working well, I might upgrade. I usually don't let it talk me off a price horse that I like just because I'm not hearing great things, or even a horse that I think is a very, very logical contender at a shorter price. Sometimes it can be a factor of, a lot of these workout viewers haven't necessarily seen the horse train daily, and all the example I will use is California Chrome before the Kentucky Derby. There were some reports coming out that he wasn't taking that well to the Churchill track, and look what he did that day. So I take it with a little bit of grain of salt with established horses, but I definitely will pay more attention to the more lightly raced ones.
Yeah, I think lightly raced is a key way to look at the works. When you're talking about 2-year-olds or even 3-year-olds or horses who have had reason to go through potential significant physical changes since the last time we saw them on a race course, these are places where I'm going to definitely be looking to apply works. And I'll tell you this, something I'll never do again. I've had, on multiple occasions in Breeders' Cup Week, sprinters who I was told were not working well, had choppy-looking strides, or worse, who have won the race and won the race impressively. I don't know what it is about sprinters that would make it be okay to not be working well and run really well, but I've seen it too many times now. I will not downgrade a horse. I will not downgrade a sprinter who isn't working well. If a sprinter makes sense on paper, that sprinter is on my tickets, and that's just all there is to it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. I mean, the other thing I will say is, I think it's just natural for there to be a little bit of confirmation bias involved. You hear a horse who's a top horse, California Chrome, Arrogant, Beholder, Stellar Wind. These are really, really, really good racehorses that have won some really big races and put in some amazing performances. That horse is working. It's only natural that you're going to expect them to perform well. And of course, they are a very, very good racehorse. So when you're comparing them to the work that you saw a few minutes ago by the 2-year-old, they're naturally going to look a little bit better. So that's why I don't put as much weight into those. You hear these great, Beholder supposedly looked great on the track today. Well, I would expect Beholder to look great on the track. So
I am glad we're going to have that clocker component to these handicapping sessions we're doing next week, and I do very much look forward to hearing that stuff, as well as trying to talk to some other people I know who look at horses for a living and see if they have anything interesting for us that we'll be permitted to share in that series of podcasts next week. Should be pretty fun. I got a non-Breeders' Cup question from Marshall Graham, who is actually teaching a course in handicapping, more or less. It's sort of an economics / handicapping course. He's a regular podcast listener too. I answered him privately, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but I'll just ask you the question for now, Mike. what books would you see as being appropriate for a curriculum designed around sort of the economics of horse race betting?
Ooh, that's a good question because it's different. It's a different spin from handicapping per se.
I do think that will be part of the class, though. So you can go that direction if you don't have an economics answer at the ready.
Sure. Well, I would imagine Steve Christ's exotic betting has got to be near the top of the list because look, it's not just the fundamentals of handicapping. It's how you can use your opinions in order to capitalize on them and make some money on them. I think even a book like yours, Pete, 6 Secrets of Successful Bettors, I think that's a natural for a course like this because it's not just, I think, horse A will win. It is how you use that opinion or conversely, I think this short price favorite will lose, how you use those opinions to turn it into actual successful wagering strategies. That I think is the key. So I would focus on books like that.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I mean, obviously I wrote the thing, so what am I going to say? But it's I do think there's some excerpts from there that would perform very well in a class like that, talking about it from a little bit more of an economic perspective, from a handicapping point of view. I mean, I think there's got to be some Andy Beyer in there.
Oh, sure.
Those books are just so unbelievable. Set the table maybe with either a full read of Picking Winners or at the very least an excerpt in terms of getting into the handicapping side of things for people who might not be there yet. I recommend that Brad Free, the Handicapping 101.
Yes.
I recommend that book all the time. I think that the updated Davidowitz Betting Thoroughbreds, that if not the whole thing, should be dealt with in excerpts. And I think to try to drill down a little on the economic side of things, Mark Kramer is a handicapping author who I'm a huge fan of, influenced me immensely. And the two things that I remember from those books the most could just as easily be in a book about any kind of market, because he deals with the importance of proper valuation. He goes through the whole process of how to make a value line.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember which book is which. One that stands out to me is Kinky Handicapping, but I'm not sure if that's the one that had the value line stuff in it. That one, though, I know got into the importance of contrarian thinking, certainly something that would belong in this course. So I would definitely say to take a look at some of those books as well. That should be pretty cool. We've got Paul Ruminelli chimes in with a couple of suggestions here. Value handicapping. I'm assuming that might be the Kramer book that I was talking about. Picking Winners from Beyer. Expert handicapping. Paul, I think, is that the book that Dave Litvin wrote?
Litvin, yes.
Yeah, which is absolutely a classic too. I wonder. I haven't read that since the day, but I would bet you anything there would be at least an excerpt from there. So the problem now we've given Marshall is we've given him about 6 semesters worth of books to make these kids read. But I guess, with the concept of excerpting it and, of course, putting in a big pitch for the kids who are interested to buy the books from the publishers, maybe that would work as well. So
yeah. And we can use this as a good jumping off point, if you don't mind.
Please.
It's funny, I didn't think it would be that controversial, but what turned out to be a somewhat controversial tweet of mine over the weekend when I said, and I don't have it in front of me, but I said something along the lines of, I would much rather bet Keen Ice in the Classic than Songbird in the Distaff.
Interesting. I didn't see that tweet.
Yeah, and some people were like, I normally respect your opinion, but you're sniffing your socks here or something like that.
I don't know what that means, but I kind of
I don't know. I think you've been sniffing your just like I don't know. I went off the rails. I don't even know what it means either, but I don't think it was a compliment.
It doesn't sound like it. No.
No. Even Ed DeRosa said, "I wish there was a way I could make some money off of this awful opinion, or I could fleece some money from you off of this awful opinion." And, I obviously in 140 characters, I can't explain the opinion.
Here's your chance. Let's do it. I have a guess at what you mean. It sounds a little crazy, but I think I know where you're going with it. But why don't you? Okay. Obviously, you should explain.
Well, and I think the preconception, or if you're thinking it's an awful opinion, you're assuming that and maybe this is how you do it, which I wouldn't recommend, but you're assuming that I'm going to approach every one of the Breeders' Cup races and bet every one of the Breeders' Cup races the exact same way. I'm going to play the Classic the same way I would play the Distaff. I'm going to play the Sprint the same way I would play the Turf. Maybe that's the case if you have an opinion that aligns in all of them, but in certain ones,
would be very rare to me. I mean, it's not a cookie cutter. That's using a saw to hang a picture on the wall. You know what I mean? You have to use the right tool for the right job.
But I think a lot of people think, okay, I'm going to bet an exacta in this race, and I'm going to bet an exacta in the next race, or I'm going to bet to win, or who's my horse to win? I think a lot of people approach it the same way, regardless of the race and regardless of their opinion. And so the underlying point behind the tweet was, in a race like the Classic, I am absolutely going to be playing the tries and the supers and the verticals. In a race like the Distaff, where I think there might only be, I haven't seen the final entries or the pre-entries, but I think there might only be 7 or 8 horses entered. I am rather unlikely to play tries and supers. And so and I'm probably unlikely to bet. I might bet an exacta maybe, but I'm unlikely to bet to win, place, or show in that race. So if I'm betting at all on the Distaff, it's most likely going to be in a multi-race wager, probably in pick 3s and pick 4s. And in cases like that, my opinion of Songbird, who may very well be one of the greatest 3-year-olds we've seen in a long time, but at the price that I'm expecting her to be, which is probably close to even money, it's a little lower. Yeah, it's a little lower right now in the UK, but we'll say even money for the sake of argument. Look, she's facing older fillies for the first time. The fillies that she's beat so far have not performed well across the board. Have not performed well against older fillies this year. It's a bit of a class test. Every one of the speed figures that I've seen have her rated as slower and great. Of course, visually she's much. I think I absolutely believe she can run faster than what we've seen, but perhaps with different pace scenarios, perhaps with a much classier group of fillies that she's facing. And this isn't a weak field of older fillies. I think, Carolina's better than she was last year. I'm a Chatterbox is probably better than she was last year. Forever Unbridled is no slouch. Not to mention the top two, Beholder and Songbird. So when you tell me that this horse, who is going to be, from my estimation, class tested, is going to be odds on, this is the kind of horse that I will play out of my multi-race wagers, just because including them costs me more and drags down my value. So if she wins, I will absolutely tip my hat and say this may very well be one of the greatest fillies we've seen in a long, long time. But if you're betting her at even money, you're assuming that she is, and I'm not quite there yet.
I mean, that's fair. I mean, but also just to clarify the original tweet, you weren't saying at all you think Keen Ice is a more likely winner in his race than Songbird is in her race, yes?
No.
Because that would be
not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Okay.
No. My point was, of my wagering dollars, I will have much, much less going through Songbird, just based on the way I'm expecting to play those races and based on what I'm expecting the prices to be, than I will on Keen Ice, because I will absolutely be using Keen Ice in my tries and supers, probably in the lower rungs, but
third
still.
And fourth, he's not an unreasonable horse for third and fourth.
I will be, if you look at just, if you think about it from the standpoint of, look, if this horse were likely to scratch and I were to get a refund, if either of them were scratched, I would get much more refunded on the combinations that include Keen Ice than any of the combinations that are likely to include Songbird.
Yeah, I'm a huge Songbird fan, and I think I know I fancy her chances a lot more than you do in her race. But even at that, I don't think that's sock sniffing material. But I do think I want to start using that line when we get some particularly crazy. Next time JK says something weird, I'm going to ask him if he's been sniffing his socks. So we'll recycle that line for sure. But yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the Distaff at length. I think for me, I mean, I understand there are some people who are so. The point about the speed figures is absolutely correct, but I just think this is one of those instances, and I think we saw another one as recently as last year with American Pharoah, where circumstances have prevented her from stopping the clock in the kind of times that most people would want to see for a horse who's going to be as short as she is. I just think that the pace advantage and the circumstances. I mean, she's one for me super duper important how she's doing that week before the race. I could see going against her if she wasn't training well, within the back of my mind, all the argument that Mike is making. But what I'm expecting is for her to be breathing fire and to have a pace advantage and to show us something special on the racetrack there. Not saying I'd only
absolutely.
use her, but I think that if I were making a value line, my value line on her might be less than even. So we'll obviously we got to see.
That's fair.
And I'd be very surprised if anything other than Stellar Wind or Beholder beat her personally. But we'll get into that more. We'll get into that more as the time comes. I want to talk a little more about the Classic. We're talking about things Mike tweeted over the weekend, and there was the big news coming out of Ballydoyle that it looks like Found is headed for the Breeders' Cup Classic, not the Breeders' Cup Turf. I think this is at least in part because that team has Highland Reel already for the turf, and the fact that she won the race last year. Now, I mean, it's deja vu all over again. I remember in the post-race comments last year from Champions Day at Ascot, Aidan O'Brien, one of the great trainers, current or really past in Ireland, talking about how Found season was probably over. Not the only reason I was against her in the turf, but certainly one of them. And so what does she go and do? She wins the turf, despite, to me, not even really looking herself, not looking anywhere near as good as she'd looked 2 weeks earlier and 4 weeks earlier. This year, same thing. Champions Day, he says that's probably, we're not so sure about the Breeders' Cup. It was something very wishy-washy about the chances of her going forward in the immediate aftermath of the race. And now, maybe he wasn't sure about the Breeders' Cup Turf, but it sounds like the Breeders' Cup Classic. Certainly an interesting decision to come from Aidan O'Brien regarding Found.
Well, and let's clarify here. I think the news that came out over the weekend was that she was going to be entered into the Classic as well. But they haven't made a final decision as to where they go. But I think you're right. It does open the door for the possibility of her moving to the Classic, since they've already got a contender who I'm sure they want to get a win for in the Breeders' Cup Turf. And if sending one of the likely favorites in the race to a different race helps their horse, then I think that's the reason to do it. And I think that the reason why they probably didn't want to put her into the filly and mare turf is, well, she's already won the big prize. Why take a consolation prize? Why take the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, to use an analogy, when you've already won the Breeders' Cup Classic? So, and I appreciate that. It's sporting of them. They're trying, if we're saying we're not going to run her in the turf, we're going to put her in on the even bigger stage. That's great. And maybe she's good enough to actually beat California Chrome and Arrogate, and not to mention Frosted and many of the best dirt horses that we have here that run regularly on dirt and show me that they are dirt horses. From a class standpoint, there's almost no knock on her. She's probably, in terms of level of horse she's faced, she's probably right up there with California Chrome, if not higher than California Chrome. My concern about her is not about class or who she's been facing. It's about surface. It's about the plan. Like, if this was the plan, Pete, you talk about a great trainer with a target. If this was the plan, why did we just hear about it?
That's not the way Europeans approach the Breeders' Cup. They don't really care about it. It's typically an after. Look at all the success they've had in the Breeders' Cup with it typically being an afterthought. The Arc was the plan, and they got that race. And so, I mean, it's not like she's going to be. I don't think she could possibly beat California Chrome, but she also doesn't really need to potentially enhance her value to the Coolmore operation in terms of she's already a broodmare prospect of the highest order. And if you could add the feather, I feel like if you could even add the feather in buyers of her potential foals mind, or maybe not even from a strictly commercial point of view, but what she could prove to run a race as well as what Declaration of War ran, another horse who I wouldn't have guessed for dirt. I mean, I think it's weird. I don't think she's a win contender, but I mean, at the same time, I totally get it.
Well, and you said a few things that I want to address. First, let's talk about Declaration of War. Yeah, he ran huge in the Classic, absolutely. But this isn't Mucho Macho Man Classic. This is a much, much tougher field than what in my mind, than what Declaration of War almost beat, and probably would have beaten if he hadn't hung on his wrong lead in the stretch. But that said, isn't this as much about Galileo as it is about Found?
You mean your case against her being in the race? I don't understand what you mean.
No. Yeah, sure. It helps the buyers of her foals, but she's going to have maybe in a long career, maybe 8 to 10 foals for auction. And yeah, sure, it will maybe help them 500 pounds or 500,000 pounds or maybe 1 million pounds at most each. But if Galileo as a sire is able to not, he's obviously,
I think the ship has sailed on establishing Galileo as a dirt sire, but like commercially, I don't know. I'm not a breeding industry guy. We really should bring in somebody who knows about it. But my gut would be just if you have in the Coolmore sort of team, if that blood, and if you go back, with any horse really, if you go back enough generations, you can see some dirt influence. If some of that happens to present itself in this horse, then in whichever direction they want to go with her, and I don't know, they probably already know or have ideas about who she's going to be bred to. That's more the way that I was thinking of it, and I agree. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Declaration of War should have won the race. I'm not saying I think she can win the race, but third.
Yeah.
I don't mind her chance. I mean, again, another horse would be absolutely huge to talk to some people about how she's getting over the dirt that week. But if she can get over the dirt, she's not worse than third in the race.
Well, so let's talk about it from a price standpoint. Where do you think she fits in terms of the actual wagering? Is she third choice?
She could be. I mean, probably fourth behind Frosted.
You think? I'm wondering if Frosted is actually going to be a little higher than what some people think.
I don't know. What's the UK betting right now?
I don't know. I don't worry about what the UK folks are betting on our dirt races. I would much more focus on what they're betting on the turf races. But I just think that, with Kieran's numbers and lack of success in California and the whole question about Frosted and even which race was he going to go to, and, just there's a lot of question marks there for him. I wonder if that's going to help the price drift up. And if you like him, that's a good thing, obviously. But especially with a horse like Found coming in here, and it gives the bettors another option and another opportunity if they're trying to beat the top horse. I just wonder if she's going to be even 5 or 6 to 1.
I'd be very, very surprised. I think what you'll see happen in the market is just a major tilt towards the top two. And I think that's the correct thing for the market to do in this case, because I think one of those two is the winner, like pretty much full stop. So I'm guessing, and this could be my own bias of the way I see the race, that you're going to see them way up there. And then, I mean, I suppose there's a world in which if there's good stories coming out of Ballydoyle and English and Irish people want to bet Found, that she could be as low as 6 to 1, but that'd be kind of crazy. I mean, I think, for I'm not going to probably bet that race vertically, but if I were, there'd need to be some sort of hook, like Frosted being pounded and her being closer to 8 or 10 to 1. I feel like Frosted being 8 or 10 to 1, and I feel like both of them being in that range is just looking at over the prospective field is kind of what feels right. But we'll see. It's certainly going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think for me, I tweeted out like it's kind of a silly to say. I maybe got a little over the top, but I guess I understand the logic behind it. But I just at the price that I'm expecting to be, because I'm expecting she will take money, and for every declaration of war or even Giants Causeway that you mentioned, I could name 5 or 6 Aidan O'Brien runners trying dirt for the first time in the Classic or in some big race. And we'll even talk about Johannesburg, sure. Okay, but let's talk about the older horses. To me, this is a reach. To me, you don't know, and you're hoping that she replicates. Yeah, and so and I think I even saw somebody on Twitter say, whatever, our Kong, and if you're telling me she's going to be the same price as our Kong, now I'll be betting her just hand over fist.
That's not
right.
going to happen.
No. I'm expecting she's going to be 8 to 10 to 1, maybe even lower, or even 12 to 1. But if at the third or fourth choice, if you're telling me she's going to take more money than Opportunity, who I think, or even certainly more than Keen Ice, I think those two. If you tell me who's the most likely winner, okay, California Chrome or maybe Arrogate or whatever, depending on your opinions. You tell me who's most likely to run third or run fourth? Opportunity. I mean, that's what he does, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Keen Ice.
You're talking about verticals. I think the direction you're going in, there makes sense. Somebody also on Twitter I saw brought up the idea that it was somehow like dangerous to run around dirt. I just don't buy that idea at all. I mean, if you have to worry about that, like. I just don't think it's valid. I mean, nobody knows their horses as well as Aidan O'Brien does. And yes, there was tragedy years ago at Monmouth, but that was obviously a weird surface. And I mean, I think that when these top level horses have these terrible things happen to them, I mean, racing's always going to be dangerous. But I don't think those. And yes, fatalities are more statistically likely, no doubt, on dirt racing than on turf. But I mean, we're dealing with such small percentages here. It's like if you're going to be in the racing game, I just don't think that factors into it at all. And if you're somebody who believes that dirt racing is so dangerous that it's a life-threatening thing to run a horse on dirt, I mean, I just don't know how you follow dirt racing at all. Because if I felt that way, I certainly wouldn't support it, because I think if it's too dangerous for Found, it's probably too dangerous for anybody to be running on. But I just don't buy that argument one bit.
No. Silly. Move on.
All right. Well, there we go. We talked about that enough. We got about 15 minutes left on the show. I think we've covered most of the stuff I had on my agenda for today, Mike. What do you think we should do with the rest of the time we have today?
Well, there's actually, it's funny, while we've been recording, there's been some news that broke. And I don't know if you saw this, Pete.
We need a breaking news sounder. If only we had a cool little mixing board so we could each hear each other and start designing sounders. What's the latest on that, by the way? Has it arrived?
No, I don't think so. I don't know if it's been ordered. So right. Don't quote me on that. It's one of the 50 things I got to do today.
Doesn't have to be today. What is this news that broke?
While we've been talking about Found, we've been talking about a lot of these foreign horses. While we've been talking, it's been announced that DRF will now have Timeform ratings for foreign horses in the past performances. So
wow, that's a bombshell. That's incredible news.
Just in time for the Breeders' Cup.
I love it.
We will have them in there. So I know for a while we had the Racing Post, and then they were gone, and now we've got the Timeform ratings in there.
It's like the old days.
Yeah. So there you go.
So people, of course, the first thing they're going to ask, equivalency on Timeform and Bayer. And the first thing I'm going to do is warn you that it's difficult unless we're making some sort of adjustment, and we'll obviously look into this. I just heard this information now. It's tricky to do with 2-year-olds because Timeform, the way they give their ratings, give like extra credits, almost like a projection into the number for 2-year-olds. Now, I don't know if those are the numbers we're going to have or if we're going to try to make something that's a little more apples to apples. In terms of the scale, it does not exactly equate in any way. I've seen complicated formulas that address it, but if you're looking for a quick and dirty, I would say to look at about minus 13 or 14. And perhaps we'll get somebody on from Timeform at some point on one of our shows between now and the Breeders' Cup to talk about how these numbers equate. But I would, for quick and dirty purposes, look at about minus 13 or 14. Very respected Timeform in the UK, and a great way to get a line on the form of these horses, and very useful in the Breeders' Cup. And now, instead of having to have a separate Timeform UK account, we can just get the information right in the DRF PPs. That's fabulous news. Was there any sort of info in the announcement about this, Mike, that people, or was it just, hey, these numbers are going to be there?
There was, yeah, and it does mention the scale a little bit, and it does mention for 3-year-olds and older. So I don't know how they're going to be addressing it with the 2-year-olds, but it says, to look at it this way, 140 plus is an outstanding horse, and I would imagine that equates to, I think, mid 120s on the buyer scale, or above 120 on the buyer scale.
Yeah.
130 to 135 above average grade 1 stakes winner, group 1 stakes winner, as it were. 125 to 129 typical grade 1 winner. 115 to 124 typical grade 2 winner, and 110 to 115 typical grade 3 winner. So
yeah, that sounds about right. And that does, obviously it gets stretched out a bit at the ends of the scale there, but you don't see too many rated 140 horses.
Sure.
But the idea of that as a quick and dirty measure to equate the scales makes sense. Well, that's very, very cool. Any other news to go along with that, or is this just it's just sort of as far as we know, a sort of a one-off deal between Timeform and DRF?
Yeah, that's the news we've got right now. I know behind the scenes, I've certainly heard rumors of this, in the office, and I knew the goal was to get it in place by Breeders' Cup. It sounds like they were able to work that out, and I know they've been testing it in the PPs to make sure it all looks okay and doesn't throw everything off. So exciting that we're able to announce it.
Yeah, that's very cool. Glad to. But another fun thing about doing a live show, we get to talk about some of this stuff, and that'll be great. I'm almost wishing we had. I'm sure that the folks who are going to be on with us on our shipper show on Tuesday will be able to discuss things in light of that, even though neither of them are Timeform people per se. We actually had reached out to a guy we've talked about on the podcast before here, Simon Rowlands, who is a freelancer who's done plenty of work for Timeform. But unfortunately, I think he's moving his house that day and couldn't join us for this one. We'll get Simon for a future show, though. Very forward-thinking, one of the people who I think does a great job using sort of a blended handicapping or form study approach, whatever you want to call it, between what you typically find in the UK and Ireland and what you find in the USA. But we're not exactly going to be missing too much with the great guests we're going to have on that Tuesday podcast anyway. So we'll give you. I feel confident in saying you're going to get some of the best info you're going to get about the European shippers on this show through that day and other friends of mine who I've known over the years. Who are over there and going to be helping provide information, like Rob Dove and Stephen Bonnick, whose thoughts will get represented. So we should get you guys loaded and hopefully get you a few winners coming from the other side of the pond when it comes to the Breeders' Cup. Now in 2 weeks' time?
A week and a half, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's right. My plane is a week from today. Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it's getting close. One other thing I'll mention in regards to the Clocker reports. We had somebody ask on Twitter when they're available. Usually the rolled up ones, the full fancy PDF is available the day before, maybe 2 days before for Breeders' Cup, since most of those horses will have worked and they've already done all of the work on the comments. But one thing to note, anybody that has a DRF Plus subscription, daily there are reports coming out. There was one about Dre Fong and how he's been working. There was a really good note. It's one of the most popular stories trending on DRF from the other day about California Chrome's work with blinkers from over the weekend. Also had a lot of notes for some other contenders, Melatonin, Opportunity, plus horses like Gormley and Terra's Tango and things like that. So even though the actual Clocker report won't be out until right before or a day before, there's still a lot of information to check out in regards to the Clocker comments on DRF.com.
Yeah, absolutely. Good information to have as we go forward. All right, we've got a couple minutes left here. If any of our live listeners have a question to ask, we can do that. Other than that, Mike, we can just spitball for a minute.
Yeah.
We're really into this calm before the storm here with the Breeders' Cup. I was doing enough. Normally, I like to do a lot more digging this past weekend on Breeders' Cup. I don't really typically look at this weekend of racing, but I was, of course, being down there, couldn't help but pay attention to the local card at the expense of doing Breeders' Cup stuff. Did you have any other interesting interactions on Twitter or thoughts about exciting upcoming Breeders' Cup stuff?
Well, I think in terms of Keeneland, we can mention the debut, and you probably saw it in person, of the connections of Tepin. Had a 2-year-old filly debut on the turf at Keeneland on Saturday, who looked very good. I think only got a buyer of 70, but there's certainly room for improvement based on what we saw with the debut. I'm talking about a horse named Tammet, of course, owned by Masterson, trained by Cassie, ridden by Leparoux. You're familiar with that team. And it looks like they've got a good one. Do you know if it's probably a little too soon to think Breeders' Cup with her? Did you talk to anybody down there about what the plans might be?
Actually saw Mr. Masterson while down there, but did not ask. Didn't have my reporter hat on, so I didn't ask that question. That would surprise me. I mean, that would seem like probably a bridge.
It's a little rush,
but you never know. You never know. People get ambitious, and that team in particular has certainly had some success getting ambitious before. But I clapped eyes and certainly very nice looking, and the performance was eye catching. Jonathan and I were watching that down by the turn, and it was one of those moves where I don't think I would have caught it the same way on TV as we saw it watching live, but you could just see the momentum building, and I had bet another horse in the race, and it was one of those you could basically just put your program down and walk away if all you cared about was betting, because it was so obvious this other one was going to win. So definitely one to keep an eye on for sure going forward.
Yeah. And I'll note that my buddy Rocco Baldelli's horse ran second in that race, ran a really big second, didn't change leads until way late, second career start. So he's over the moon about that one, and nothing wrong to running second to a horse like Tammet, who looks like she has a big future.
Yeah, getting that to those flashy debut winners. Who knows? Maybe the form of that race will come out well. It's hard getting final time on those debut turf horses. It's a tough measure. Those are
right.
That's one example of the type of race that I really like to use Formulator after they've run back and go back and look and see how those figures fit in, because I think there's a lot, just naturally a lot of room for interpretation in terms of the figures there. I didn't look at those figures particularly, but it visually looked faster than that, so it's one that's probably worth going back and taking a look at in a few months when horses run back, just as a matter of course, the same way I do with any debuting 2-year-olds on the turf, where they don't run so many races in the day as dirt to really be able to feel that 100% confidence in the number. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that before. You see a horse that runs really well. I think an example was Oscar Performance at Saratoga, won by 10 lengths, and maybe looked a little bit better than what you could have. I mean, how do you do a figure for that? Do you give the horse that ran second to 70 something, and then this one in the 90s? It's the debut, especially, or a lightly raced one, they can jump up huge. So it's something that I take with a grain of salt, and I always monitor going forward.
Yeah, the other thing is with the way the turf races are won, that burst of speed that I was referring to, that's more the speed figure can be absolutely right, but it just doesn't tell the full story. And the story is that the way Tammet can accelerate over the couple of furlongs when the real running starts in a turf race. And knowing the horse has that club in the bag can sometimes mean more than will mean. I'm going to go further than that. That means more to me in turf racing, because the dynamics of turf racing than just looking at raw final times. It's why raw final times are so difficult with turf racing, and folks like Timeform, like the Bayer team, you tend. Obviously, time is a big component in a turf speed figure, but you're looking at other things as well just to make the numbers make sense in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what figures you expect horses to run at certain class levels and what horses usually run. Those things become a bit more of a factor when you're making speed figures on the turf than they do on the dirt.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I use those come home times. I just change the incremental or the fractions to incremental splits and formulator, especially use that on turf. The fastest last fractions, they're a big part of my turf handicapping.
All right. Anything else from Keeneland or from Belmont? Lightstream certainly righted the ship. And just
did.
After the race, I was just thinking to myself, like, how did that race in Saratoga go wrong?
Yeah. Well, look, she looked really good. I think I was kind of on the right track about doubting some of the short-priced horses, and she's the only one of them who ran really well or ran big. I think there were a lot of opportunities. Of course, I was on the wrong big-priced horses for at least for the place and show portions of it, but still my horse ran okay at 46-1 and was the longest price in the race. And, I will take that sort of approach, especially when a lot of the favorites are ones that I knock. But Lightstream ran big. I think they're talking about, I can't remember which race. They were at first thinking that she was done for the year. I think they might try and squeeze one more race into her before next year. But she looks good.
Yeah, she's worth taking a look at going forward. She sure can't finish.
What about you? You mentioned Belmont. Did you watch any of the races there?
Yeah, we had it on. We had it on in the green room.
What about Bar of Gold?
Yeah, that was awesome. I mean,
performance of the week, right?
I think all three of us picked Wonder Gal. I mean, that was really a 2-horse race on paper.
Yeah.
And the direction that we went with the way the weather came up scratched, and I thought it was 20 lengths watching live. I guess the official margin was 16 3/4 or something.
Who knows? I don't know how they figure that out. But she got a 109 buyer, by far the biggest buyer of the weekend, and she's good. I mean, I've always liked her. I think I'm a little disappointed because after that, Kimmel, the trainer, came out and said, "Look, we want to try her on turf at some point. We think she'll be a monster on the turf." I had been hoping for that prior because her dam was a really good turf runner. She was really competitive on dirt. I was waiting for her to get to the turf. Now off that huge buyer, she's going to be almost unbettable wherever she goes next.
Going to be a shorter price for that. That's for sure. But you never know. I mean, you run into some monsters, or you just get the right setup.
I guess.
Don't always have to shy away from that lower end of the odds spectrum. But it's certainly true that when you're picking ones like you picked in the Lightstream race, you don't have to be right very often at 46-1. About once a year should get you out when you're playing in that in that range. So different ways of approaching the game for sure, but that's the fun thing. They can, in the right situation, they can all work out. Any closing thoughts, Mike, before we send it away on this Tuesday afternoon?
No, we've just we got a lot of stuff coming up. I mean, the next time we talk, we'll be right on the heels of all of those podcasts and webinars next week, and I know you and I have a lot of prep to do, so
Absolutely.
It should be fun.
Let's get to it. All right, I want to thank Mike Hogan. I want to thank everybody for listening, especially those of you who tuned in live. I haven't quite figured this out. Is the best way for folks to listen in live, Mike, to just go to my Twitter feed, or is there a way to go to Spreaker.com and find us? What would you recommend for that?
There is, if you want to go to Spreaker, and that's probably the way to bookmark it, is Spreaker.com and then search for DRF Formulator, who is the user. I set up the account under DRF Formulator. So if you search for that, you'll find it. You can bookmark that page. Anytime there's a new live one that shows up, it appears there. I also tweeted it before. I can tweet it out again. But, of course, after the Breeders' Cup, the goal is to also go live on DRF.com leading into match show. You'll find long and short of it is there'll be multiple ways to find us live.
Excellent. I like to hear that. We will be back on Friday with a look ahead to the weekend's races. If you're playing this week, may you win all your photos. 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 Win all your photos.